The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Sarah Mitchell adjusted her small backpack and looked up at the imposing iron gates. At 8 years old, she had never seen anything quite so magnificent. The golden details gleamed in the early light, and the red uniformed guards stood perfectly still like toy soldiers come to life. Sarah's grandmother, Margaret, held her hand gently as they approached the crowd of tourists already gathering for the changing of the guard ceremony. Margaret had promised this special trip to London for Sarah's birthday, and the little girl had been counting down the days for weeks. "Grandma, when will we see the horses?" Sarah asked, bouncing slightly on her toes with excitement. She had always loved horses, spending hours drawing them in her notebooks and dreaming of riding across green fields like the princesses in her favorite books. "Soon, my dear," Margaret smiled, though she noticed the worried look that crossed Sarah's face. The little girl had been unusually quiet during their train journey from Manchester, and Margaret suspected something was troubling her granddaughter beyond simple excitement about the trip. What Margaret didn't know was that Sarah carried a heavy secret in her young heart. Just 2 weeks earlier, her parents had sat her down for what they called a serious talk. They explained that Daddy would be moving to a different house, and that sometimes families change even when everyone still loves each other very much. Sarah didn't fully understand what divorce meant, but she understood enough to know that nothing would ever be quite the same again. The crowd thickened around them as more tourists arrived, cameras ready and guidebooks in hand. Sarah found herself pressed between strangers, feeling smaller and more lost with each passing minute. The excited chatter of the crowd seemed to echo strangely in her ears, and she gripped her grandmother's hand tighter. "Look there, Sarah," Margaret pointed toward the palace gates. "I think I can hear them coming." The distant sound of hoofbeats on stone grew louder, accompanied by the jingle of harnesses and the measured footsteps of marching guards. Sarah pushed forward with the crowd, trying to get a better view, but all she could see were the backs and elbows of adults much taller than herself. Then, through a small gap between two tourists, she caught her first glimpse of the horses. They were magnificent beyond anything she had imagined. Jet black with flowing manes and tails, their coats gleamed like polished ebony in the morning sun. The mounted guards sat tall and proud in their ceremonial uniforms, red tunics bright as summer roses and golden buttons catching the light. But it was the horses themselves that captured Sarah's complete attention. They moved with such grace and dignity, their heads held high and their steps perfectly synchronized. Each horse seemed to know exactly how important and special this moment was, carrying themselves with a quiet pride that made Sarah's heart flutter with wonder. As the procession moved closer to where Sarah stood, she noticed something remarkable about the lead horse. While all the horses were beautiful, this one seemed different somehow. His name was Wellington, though Sarah didn't know this yet. Wellington was a 15-year-old gelding who had served in the Queen's Guard for nearly a decade, and he possessed an almost supernatural awareness of the people around him. Wellington's large, dark eyes seemed to scan the crowd as he passed, and when his gaze fell upon Sarah's upturned face, something extraordinary happened. The great horse slowed his pace almost imperceptibly, his ears pricking forward with interest. His rider, Sergeant James Thornton, noticed the subtle change but trusted his mount's instincts completely. Sarah felt her breath catch as Wellington's eyes met hers. In that moment, the noise of the crowd faded away, and she felt as though she and the beautiful horse were the only two beings in the entire world. Wellington's expression seemed kind and understanding, as though he could somehow sense the sadness she carried inside her small chest. The moment lasted only a few seconds before the procession continued on, but Sarah remained transfixed, watching until Wellington disappeared around the corner toward the palace courtyard where the ceremony would take place. She tugged on her grandmother's sleeve urgently. "Grandma, did you see? The big black horse, he looked right at me." Margaret smiled indulgently, assuming this was simply childhood imagination at work. "Yes, dear, they're all very beautiful horses. Shall we follow along and watch the ceremony?" But, as they made their way around to the viewing area with the rest of the crowd, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something special had just happened. She had felt a connection with Wellington that she couldn't quite put into words, a moment of understanding that seemed to reach right into her worried heart and offer comfort. The changing of the guard ceremony was every bit as spectacular as Margaret had promised. The precision of the movements, the bright colors of the uniforms, and the musical accompaniment all combined to create a display that should have filled Sarah with complete delight. And, yet, she found herself searching constantly for glimpses of Wellington among the other horses. When she finally spotted him again, Wellington was standing at attention with his rider during the inspection portion of the ceremony. His posture was perfect, his expression alert and professional, but, when his gaze swept across the crowd and found Sarah once more, she could have sworn she saw something soften in his eyes. This time, Wellington did something that surprised even Sergeant Thornton. The horse turned his head slightly toward where Sarah stood, a movement so subtle that most observers wouldn't have noticed it at all. But, Sarah noticed, and she felt her heart lift with a joy she hadn't experienced since her parents' difficult conversation 2 weeks ago. After the ceremony concluded and the guards began to disperse, Sarah begged her grandmother to stay a little longer. "Please, Grandma, can we wait and see if the horses come back this way?" Margaret checked her watch and considered their schedule for the day, but something in Sarah's voice made her reconsider their plans. "All right, dear, but just for a few more minutes." As the crowd began to thin out, Sarah positioned herself near the fence where she had the best view of the pathway the horses would take returning to their stables. Her persistence was rewarded when Wellington appeared once again, this time walking at a more relaxed pace alongside several other guard horses. What happened next would stay with Sarah for the rest of her life. Wellington approached the fence where she stood, moving closer than necessary to the barrier that separated the horses from the public. He lowered his great head toward Sarah, his breath warm and sweet as he exhaled softly near her face. Sarah reached up tentatively, hardly daring to believe that this magnificent creature was actually seeking her attention. Wellington remained perfectly still as her small fingers touched his velvet nose, his dark eyes never leaving her face. "Hello, beautiful horse," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "You're the most wonderful horse I've ever seen." Wellington seemed to understand every word. He nuzzled gently against Sarah's palm, his touch as soft as a whisper. In that moment, all the sadness and confusion about her parents' separation seemed to fade away, replaced by a sense of peace and connection that she had never experienced before. Sergeant Thornton, still mounted on Wellington's back, watched this interaction with growing amazement. In all his years of service, he had never seen his horse show such specific interest in a member of the public. Wellington was always professional and well-behaved, but this display of affection was completely unprecedented. "He likes you," Sergeant Thornton said kindly, looking down at Sarah with a warm smile. "Wellington doesn't usually take such a shine to visitors." "His name is Wellington?" Sarah asked, her eyes bright with delight. "That's right. He's been serving Her Majesty for many years now, and he's one of our finest horses." The sergeant's voice carried genuine affection for his mount. "You must be very special for him to notice you like this." Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest at these words. After weeks of feeling like her whole world was changing in frightening ways, here was something beautiful and stable and kind. Wellington represented everything she wished for in her young life: strength, gentleness, and unwavering loyalty. Margaret approached slowly, not wanting to interrupt the magical moment but also aware that they needed to move on with their day. As she drew closer, she was struck by the transformation in her granddaughter's demeanor. The worry lines around Sarah's eyes had disappeared, replaced by a glow of pure happiness. "We'll need to go soon, Sarah," Margaret said gently. Sarah nodded reluctantly, but she wasn't quite ready to say goodbye. "Wellington, I have to go now, but I'll never forget you," she said solemnly, as though making a sacred promise. Wellington seemed to understand the gravity of this moment. He touched his nose to Sarah's forehead once more, a gentle blessing that felt like a promise in return. Then, with the discipline that had made him one of the Queen's finest guard horses, he stepped back and waited for his rider's signal to continue on their way. As Sarah watched Wellington walk away toward the royal stables, she felt something shift inside her heart. The pain and confusion about her parents' situation hadn't disappeared entirely, but it no longer felt overwhelming. Instead, she carried with her the memory of Wellington's kind eyes and gentle touch, proof that there was still magic and beauty in the world even when things seemed dark and uncertain. That was quite something, wasn't it? Margaret said as they finally began to walk away from the palace. Grandma, Sarah said thoughtfully, do you think Wellington knew I was sad? Margaret paused, considering her answer carefully. She had witnessed the entire interaction and couldn't deny that something unusual had occurred. I think horses are very wise creatures, dear. They have a way of understanding things that we might not even realize we're feeling. I want to come back and see him again someday, Sarah announced with determination. Perhaps we can arrange that, Margaret replied, though she privately wondered if such a thing would be possible. As they walked through the streets of London toward their next destination, Sarah chatted excitedly about Wellington and all the details she had noticed about him. His shiny black coat, his intelligent eyes, the way he had moved with such grace and purpose. Margaret listened with growing amazement at how much the encounter had affected her granddaughter. That evening, as they sat in their hotel room reviewing the photos from their day, Sarah couldn't stop talking about her meeting with Wellington. She carefully drew pictures of him in her notebook, trying to capture every detail she remembered about his appearance and the way he had made her feel. Do you think all the guard horses are as nice as Wellington? She asked as Margaret helped her get ready for bed. I suspect they're all special in their own ways, Margaret replied. But Wellington certainly seems to be extraordinary. As Sarah drifted off to sleep that night, her dreams were filled with images of black horses with flowing manes and kind eyes. She imagined herself riding across green fields on Wellington's back, the wind in her hair and all her worries left far behind. What Sarah didn't know was that her story with Wellington was far from over. In the royal stables that same evening, the magnificent horse stood in his comfortable stall, but his thoughts seemed far away. Sergeant Thornton had never seen anything quite like Wellington's behavior that day, and he found himself wondering about the little girl who had so completely captured his horse's attention. Wellington, for his part, carried the memory of Sarah's gentle touch and sad eyes. In his own way, he understood that he had offered comfort to a small human who needed it, and the knowledge filled him with a quiet satisfaction that would stay with him long after the lights in the stable were dimmed for the night. The seeds of an extraordinary friendship had been planted in those few precious minutes by the palace fence, and, though neither Sarah nor Wellington could have known it then, their paths were destined to cross again in ways that would prove just how deep the bond between human and horse could truly be. 3 months had passed since Sarah's magical encounter with Wellington, but the memory remained as vivid as ever in her young mind. The divorce proceedings between her parents had been finalized, and life had settled into a new, sometimes confusing routine of weekends with Dad and weekdays with Mom. Sarah had adapted better than anyone expected, though her family noticed she had developed an intense fascination with horses that seemed to provide her with comfort during difficult moments. Meanwhile, in the bustling city of London, something unexpected was happening in the world of the Queen's Guard. A documentary film crew had been granted unprecedented access to film the daily lives of the ceremonial horses and their riders. The project, titled Guardians of Tradition, aimed to showcase the dedication and skill required to maintain one of Britain's most beloved traditions. Director Emma Patterson had spent weeks negotiating for this opportunity, and she was determined to capture something truly special. What she didn't anticipate was how much the horses themselves would steal the spotlight from their human counterparts. Wellington had been selected as one of the primary subjects for the documentary, much to Sergeant Thornton's pride. The camera crews followed them through their daily routines, the early morning grooming sessions, the careful inspection of tack and equipment, the practice drills in the covered riding school, and, of course, the ceremonial duties that brought them before the public eye. It was during one of these filming sessions that Wellington's unique gift for connecting with people became apparent to the entire production team. The crew had positioned themselves near the palace gates to capture footage of the changing of the guard ceremony when something remarkable happened that would change everything. A group of children from a local school had come to watch the ceremony as part of an educational trip about British history and traditions. Among them was a boy named Marcus, who used a wheelchair due to a condition called spina bifida. Marcus was 10 years old, intelligent and curious, but often felt left out during school outings because of the physical limitations imposed by his condition. As the ceremonial procession approached, the other children pushed forward eagerly to get a better view, leaving Marcus somewhat isolated at the back of the group. His teacher, Mrs. Henderson, stayed nearby but was momentarily distracted helping another student who had dropped her camera. Wellington, approaching with his usual dignity and precision, seemed to sense something different about this particular gathering. His keen eyes quickly identified Marcus sitting quietly in his wheelchair, separated from the excitement of his classmates. Without any signal from Sergeant Thornton, Wellington began to alter his path very slightly, moving closer to where Marcus waited. The documentary cameras, originally focused on capturing the pageantry of the ceremony, suddenly found themselves witnessing something far more profound. Wellington approached Marcus with deliberate care, his powerful hooves moving with extra precision on the cobblestones to avoid any sound that might startle the boy. Marcus looked up in wonder as the magnificent horse drew near. He had always loved horses from a distance, but had never imagined being so close to one, especially not one as majestic as Wellington. The horse's coat gleamed like black silk in the afternoon sun, and his intelligent eyes seemed to hold depths of understanding that took Marcus's breath away. Wellington stopped directly in front of Marcus's wheelchair, ignoring the excited whispers from the other children who had now noticed what was happening. The great horse lowered his head until he was at Marcus's eye level, his expression gentle and patient as though he had all the time in the world. "Hello there, beautiful boy," Marcus whispered, using the same tone he employed when talking to his pet cat at home. "You're absolutely amazing." Wellington's response was immediate and heartwarming. He stretched his neck forward just enough to allow Marcus to touch his face, his breath warm and sweet against the boy's outstretched fingers. The horse remained perfectly still, as though he understood the precious nature of this moment and didn't want to do anything that might break the spell. Mrs. Henderson, who had turned around just in time to witness this interaction, felt tears spring to her eyes. In all her years of teaching, she had rarely seen Marcus look so absolutely joyful. The boy's face was radiant with wonder and delight as he gently stroked Wellington's nose. "He's so soft," Marcus marveled, his voice filled with awe. "And his eyes are so kind. It's like he knows exactly how I'm feeling." Sergeant Thornton, still mounted on Wellington's back, watched this exchange with growing amazement. This was the second time in recent months that his horse had shown such extraordinary sensitivity toward a child who seemed to need special attention. He was beginning to realize that Wellington possessed an almost supernatural ability to identify people who were carrying emotional burdens and offer them exactly the kind of comfort they needed most. The documentary cameras captured every moment of this beautiful interaction, with director Patterson quickly realizing that she was witnessing something that would become the heart of her film. This wasn't just a story about tradition and ceremony anymore, it was a story about the deeper connections that could exist between humans and animals, and the healing power of unexpected kindness. After several precious minutes, Wellington carefully stepped back from Marcus's wheelchair, but not before giving the boy one final, gentle nuzzle. The horse then resumed his position in the ceremonial formation as though nothing unusual had occurred, though the impact of his actions rippled through everyone who had witnessed them. Marcus spent the rest of the school trip glowing with excitement, telling anyone who would listen about his encounter with the most wonderful horse in the whole world. His classmates, who had never seen him quite so animated, began to include him more naturally in their conversations and activities. Word of Wellington's behavior quickly spread among the royal household staff and the broader community of people who worked with the ceremonial horses. Stories began to emerge of other instances where Wellington had shown unusual sensitivity and kindness, though none quite as dramatic as his encounters with Sarah and Marcus. Stable manager Robert Clark, who had worked with ceremonial horses for over 30 years, found himself paying closer attention to Wellington's behavior. During the quiet hours between ceremonies, he noticed how the horse seemed to watch people with unusual intensity, as though he were constantly assessing their emotional states and looking for opportunities to offer comfort. "That horse has got something special about him," Robert confided to his assistant, Lucy Chen. "I've worked with hundreds of horses over the years, but I've never seen anything quite like Wellington's ability to connect with people who are struggling." Lucy had noticed it too. During stable tours given to visitors, Wellington always seemed to gravitate toward children who appeared shy or upset, offering them gentle interactions that invariably brightened their spirits. She had started to think of him as their unofficial therapy horse, though his primary role remained ceremonial duties. The documentary crew continued following Wellington for several more weeks, and they captured numerous additional examples of his extraordinary empathy. There was the elderly war veteran who broke down crying when Wellington approached him during a memorial service, and the young girl with autism who had been overwhelmed by the crowds until Wellington's calm presence helped her find peace. Each incident reinforced Director Patterson's growing conviction that Wellington represented something profound about the relationship between humans and animals. Her documentary was evolving into something much deeper than she had originally planned, a meditation on kindness, healing, and the unexpected ways that comfort could appear in our lives. Meanwhile, back in Manchester, Sarah continued to treasure her memories of Wellington while dealing with the ongoing challenges of her parents' separation. She had started taking riding lessons at a local stable, though none of the horses there seemed to possess Wellington's special magic. Her instructor, Janet Morrison, was impressed by Sarah's natural ability and her obvious love for horses. "You have real talent, Sarah," Janet told her one afternoon after a particularly good lesson. "And, more importantly, you have the right temperament for working with horses. They can sense that you truly care about them." Sarah beamed with pride at this praise, but privately she knew that her love for horses had been awakened by one very special horse in particular. She often found herself wondering what Wellington was doing at any given moment, and whether he ever thought about their brief but magical encounter. What Sarah couldn't have known was that Wellington did indeed remember her. Horses have excellent memories, particularly for emotional experiences, and his encounter with the sad little girl by the palace fence had left a lasting impression. In quiet moments in his stable, Wellington would sometimes lift his head as though listening for something, his expression thoughtful and distant. Sergeant Thornton had begun to recognize these moments and had developed his own theory about what was happening. He believed that Wellington was somehow attuned to the emotional needs of people around him in a way that went far beyond normal horse behavior. The sergeant had started documenting these instances, creating an informal record of Wellington's extraordinary acts of kindness. One particularly memorable incident occurred during a state visit when a young foreign diplomat's daughter became separated from her family in the crowd outside the palace. The little girl, who spoke very little English, was crying and clearly distressed when Wellington spotted her from across the courtyard. Without any prompting from his rider, Wellington began moving toward the child, his steps measured and careful. When he reached her, he lowered his head and made soft nickering sounds that seemed to calm her immediately. The girl stopped crying and reached out to touch Wellington's face, her fear replaced by wonder. Within minutes, palace security had located the child's frantic parents, but it was Wellington who had provided the crucial comfort that prevented the situation from becoming truly traumatic. The girl's mother spoke tearfully about how grateful she was for the horse's intervention, calling him an angel with 4 legs. These stories began to attract attention beyond the documentary crew. Journalists started requesting interviews about the miracle horse of the Queen's Guard, and Wellington found himself becoming something of a celebrity in his own right. But fame didn't change his gentle nature or his uncanny ability to identify people who needed his special brand of comfort. Dr. Sarah Williams, an animal behaviorist from Cambridge University, became interested in Wellington's case and requested permission to observe him during his daily routines. What she discovered challenged many conventional assumptions about horse cognition and emotional intelligence. Wellington demonstrates an extraordinary level of empathetic awareness, Dr. Williams explained in her preliminary report. He appears to be capable of reading human emotional states with remarkable accuracy and responding appropriately to provide comfort. This level of interspecies emotional intelligence is extremely rare and suggests that some animals may be capable of much more complex emotional processing than we previously understood. As Wellington's reputation grew, requests began coming in from various charitable organizations hoping to arrange special visits. The royal household was cautious about these requests, not wanting to exploit Wellington's unique gifts or disrupt his primary duties, but they were also moved by the profound impact he seemed to have on people who were struggling. A compromise was reached that would allow Wellington to participate in carefully selected therapeutic visits while maintaining his ceremonial responsibilities. The first of these special visits was arranged with a children's hospital in London, where young patients dealing with serious illnesses would have the opportunity to meet the famous gentle giant. The visit was scheduled for a quiet Saturday morning when Wellington would normally have been resting. Sergeant Thornton volunteered to accompany him, understanding that this was about much more than simply showing off a beautiful horse. This was about sharing Wellington's gift for healing with children who desperately needed reasons for hope. As they prepared for this new chapter in Wellington's service, everyone involved felt a sense of anticipation about what might unfold. Wellington seemed to sense that something special was planned, his attitude alert and eager as though he understood that his unique abilities were about to be put to their most important use yet. The night before the hospital visit, Wellington stood quietly in his stable, his dark eyes reflecting the soft glow of the stable lights. If horses could dream about the future, Wellington might have been dreaming about the small faces he would meet tomorrow, and the comfort he might be able to offer to children who were fighting battles much too big for their young hearts to carry alone. The morning sun filtered through the windows of St. Bartholomew's Children's Hospital as nurses and staff prepared for a very special visitor. Word had spread quickly through the pediatric ward that Wellington, the famous Queen's Guard horse, would be coming to meet some of the young patients. The excitement was palpable, though tinged with the gentle hope that characterized a place where children fought daily battles against illness and injury. Dr. Amanda Foster, the hospital's head of pediatric oncology, had been skeptical when the request first came through official channels. She had seen too many well-meaning celebrity visits that promised more than they delivered, leaving disappointed children in their wake. But, something about Wellington's documented history of connecting with troubled children had convinced her to give this unusual therapy session a chance. "Remember, children," announced Nurse Patricia as she gathered the small group of patients who would participate in today's visit, "Wellington is a working horse with important jobs, so we need to be very gentle and quiet around him." The group consisted of 6 children, ranging in age from 5 to 12, each facing their own unique challenges. There was Emma, 7 years old and battling leukemia, who had been in the hospital for 3 months and missed her family's farm terribly. Tommy, age 9, had been born with a severe heart defect and was awaiting his 3rd surgery. Lily, just 5 years old, had been in a car accident that left her with a traumatic brain injury, and she hadn't spoken a word since arriving at the hospital 2 weeks earlier. Also joining the group was David, an 11-year-old boy with cystic fibrosis who maintained his sense of humor despite frequent hospital stays, and Sophie, age 8, who was recovering from surgery to repair a severe spinal condition. Finally, there was Alex, a 12-year-old who had lost his leg to bone cancer but refused to let his prosthetic slow him down. The hospital had arranged for Wellington's visit to take place in their therapeutic garden, a peaceful courtyard space designed to provide patients with access to fresh air and natural beauty. The area had been carefully prepared with soft rubber matting to ensure Wellington's safety on the hospital grounds, and staff members were positioned strategically to ensure everything went smoothly. Sergeant Thornton arrived with Wellington at precisely 10 o'clock, having taken extra care with the horse's grooming that morning. Wellington's coat gleamed like polished ebony, and his tack was spotless. But, more importantly, the horse seemed to understand that today was different from his usual ceremonial duties. His demeanor was calm but alert, his ears pricked forward with interest as he took in the new environment. As they entered the therapeutic garden, Wellington's gaze immediately focused on the small group of children waiting for him. Dr. Foster watched carefully as the horse's expression seemed to soften, his large dark eyes taking in each child's face with an intensity that was both gentle and deeply attentive. The first child to approach was David, whose outgoing personality hadn't been dimmed by his medical challenges. "Wow, he's even more beautiful than I imagined," David said, his voice filled with genuine awe. "Can I really touch him?" Sergeant Thornton nodded encouragingly. "Wellington would be honored to meet you, David. He's very gentle, so don't be afraid." David stepped forward confidently and placed his hand on Wellington's neck. The horse remained perfectly still, allowing the boy to stroke his smooth coat. "He feels so strong," David marveled. "But, his eyes are so kind. It's like he understands that we're sick and he wants to help us feel better." Wellington seemed to respond to David's cheerful energy by turning his head slightly toward the boy, acknowledging his presence with a soft nickering sound that made David's face light up with delight. Next came Emma, who approached more hesitantly. The months of treatment had left her thin and pale, and she moved with the careful steps of someone whose body had been through a great deal. Wellington seemed to sense her fragility immediately, lowering his head until he was at her eye level and waiting patiently for her to make the first move. "Hello, Wellington," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. "I used to have horses on my grandpa's farm, but I haven't seen them since I got sick. I miss them so much." Wellington's response was immediate and heartbreaking. He moved closer to Emma, gently resting his chin near her shoulder in what could only be described as a horse hug. Emma's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of joy rather than sadness. "He knows," she said wonderingly. "He knows how much I miss being around horses." "Oh, Wellington, you're just like the horses back home, but somehow even more special." Dr. Foster, who had been watching from a distance, found herself moved beyond her expectations. She had worked with therapy animals before, but Wellington's behavior went far beyond anything she had previously witnessed. The horse seemed to be making conscious decisions about how to interact with each child based on their individual needs. Tommy stepped forward next, his hand instinctively moving to his chest where surgical scars were hidden beneath his hospital shirt. Wellington seemed to understand that this boy carried physical pain, and his approach was infinitely gentle. The horse simply stood quietly, allowing Tommy to lean against his strong shoulder for support. "My heart doesn't work right," Tommy explained to Wellington in a matter-of-fact tone that children often use when discussing their medical conditions. "But being close to you makes it feel better somehow. Like your heart is strong enough for both of us." Wellington remained motionless, providing a living pillar of strength for Tommy to rest against. The boy closed his eyes and seemed to draw comfort from the horse's steady presence and rhythmic breathing. But it was Wellington's interaction with Lily that truly demonstrated the depth of his intuitive understanding. The little girl had remained at the back of the group, her silence a result of the trauma she had experienced. She watched the other children with Wellington but made no move to approach him herself. Wellington, however, had been aware of Lily from the moment he entered the garden. Something about her stillness and the sadness in her young eyes seemed to call to him. After spending time with the other children, Wellington began to move slowly in Lily's direction, his steps careful and non-threatening. When he reached her, Wellington did something extraordinary. Instead of trying to engage her directly, he simply lay down on the soft grass beside where she sat in her wheelchair. This massive, powerful horse made himself vulnerable and small, positioning himself so that Lily could touch him easily if she chose to, but without any pressure to do so. For several minutes, they remained like this, Lily in her wheelchair and Wellington lying peacefully beside her. Gradually, the little girl began to reach out tentatively, her small fingers first touching Wellington's mane and, then, moving to stroke his neck. "Horse," Lily whispered suddenly, the first word she had spoken since her accident. Nice horse. The sound of her voice sent a ripple of excitement through all the adults present, but they remained carefully quiet, not wanting to overwhelm the moment. Wellington responded to Lily's words by making soft, gentle sounds of his own, as though he were answering her in horse language. Lily's face began to show the first signs of animation that anyone had seen since her arrival at the hospital. She continued to pet Wellington's neck, and, gradually began to whisper more words to him. Soft horse. Good horse. Stay with Lily. Dr. Foster felt tears spring to her eyes as she witnessed this breakthrough. She had been working with Lily's medical team for weeks trying to find ways to help the little girl begin to communicate again, and, here Wellington had accomplished in minutes what trained professionals had been struggling to achieve for weeks. Sophie, who had been watching Wellington's interaction with Lily, wheeled her chair closer to where the horse lay. Her recent spinal surgery made movement painful, but she was determined to spend time with this remarkable animal. Wellington seemed to understand her physical limitations and remained perfectly still as Sophie positioned herself where she could comfortably reach him. You're helping all of us, aren't you? Sophie said quietly to Wellington. Somehow you know exactly what each of us needs. Emma needed to remember her grandpa's horses, Tommy needed to feel strong, and Lily needed to find her voice again. What do you think I need? Wellington lifted his head slightly to look at Sophie, his dark eyes seeming to study her face intently. Then, he did something that surprised everyone present. He carefully shifted his position so that his head was resting gently across Sophie's lap, the weight distributed so carefully that it provided comfort without causing any discomfort to her healing body. Oh, Sophie breathed, her hands moving instinctively to stroke Wellington's ears. You think I need to feel useful, don't you? Like I can take care of someone else instead of always being the one who needs taking care of. The insight was remarkable in its accuracy. Sophie had been struggling with feeling helpless during her recovery, frustrated by her temporary physical limitations and the constant attention from medical staff. Wellington had somehow sensed that what she needed most was to feel capable and nurturing again. Alex, the oldest of the group, had been hanging back somewhat, his natural preteen self-consciousness making him hesitant to show enthusiasm about meeting a horse. But, as he watched Wellington's interactions with the other children, his reserve began to melt away. That's pretty amazing, Alex admitted, moving closer to the group. I mean, I wasn't sure about this whole thing, but you really do seem to understand what everyone needs. Wellington rose gracefully from his lying position and approached Alex with dignified steps. The horse seemed to recognize that this older child needed to be treated more as an equal than as someone requiring comfort. Instead of offering the gentle, protective behavior he had shown the younger children, Wellington presented himself to Alex with quiet respect. I lost my leg to cancer, Alex said directly, his tone matter-of-fact but with an underlying vulnerability. Sometimes I feel like I'm not the same person I used to be. Like I'm broken somehow. Wellington responded by standing perfectly straight and tall, his posture proud and strong. He seemed to be showing Alex that being different didn't mean being less than whole. The horse's quiet dignity and obvious self-respect provided a powerful example of how to carry oneself with confidence despite physical differences. Alex reached out to touch Wellington's shoulder, and the connection between them was immediately apparent. You're right, Alex said softly. Being different doesn't make us broken, does it? It just makes us special. As the official visit time drew to a close, none of the children wanted to say goodbye to Wellington. The horse had provided each of them with exactly what they needed most, offering comfort, strength, hope, and healing in ways that seemed almost magical. Sergeant Thornton, who had witnessed many of Wellington's extraordinary interactions over the months, was still amazed by what had transpired in the hospital garden. I've never seen anything quite like this, he confided to Dr. Foster as the children reluctantly prepared to return to their rooms. Wellington has always been special, but today he outdid himself. Dr. Foster nodded, her mind already working on plans to document this remarkable therapy session and explore possibilities for future visits. What we witnessed today goes far beyond typical animal-assisted therapy, she said. Wellington demonstrated a level of emotional intelligence and empathetic response that I wouldn't have believed possible if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. As Wellington prepared to leave the hospital, each child said their personal goodbye to him. Emma promised to think of him whenever she missed the horses back home. Tommy told him that he would remember how it felt to have such a strong heart nearby whenever he faced his next surgery. Lily, still speaking in whispers but speaking nonetheless, asked if Wellington would come back to visit her again. Sophie thanked Wellington for helping her remember that she could be strong and nurturing even while she was healing. David promised to tell everyone he met about the amazing horse who could understand what people needed in their hearts. And Alex, with newfound confidence, told Wellington that he would always remember the lesson about being different but not broken. As they left the hospital grounds, Wellington walked with his usual dignified stride, but Sergeant Thornton could sense a particular satisfaction in his bearing. The horse had used his remarkable gifts to bring healing and hope to children who desperately needed both, and the experience seemed to have enriched his own spirit as well. The news of Wellington's successful hospital visit spread quickly through both medical and equestrian communities. Requests for similar visits began pouring in from hospitals, therapy centers, and organizations working with children facing various challenges. But, perhaps more importantly, the story of Wellington's extraordinary empathy began to inspire people to look more closely at the animals in their own lives and to consider the possibility that the bonds between humans and animals might be far deeper and more meaningful than they had ever imagined. 6 months after Wellington's transformative visit to St. Bartholomew's Children's Hospital, his reputation as a healing horse had spread far beyond London. The documentary, Guardians of Tradition, had premiered to critical acclaim, with Wellington's story touching viewers around the world. But, perhaps the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source, a letter that arrived at the Royal Mews addressed specifically to Wellington, written in careful 8-year-old handwriting. Sarah Mitchell had spent weeks crafting her letter, with her grandmother Margaret helping her with the spelling of difficult words. The letter read, "Dear Wellington, my name is Sarah and I met you last year when I was visiting London with my grandma. You were so nice to me when I was feeling sad about my parents. I have been learning to ride horses because of you, and my teacher says I'm really good at it. I wanted to tell you that you helped me understand that even when things change, there can still be beautiful and kind things in the world. I hope I can see you again someday. Your friend, Sarah." When Sergeant Thornton read the letter aloud to Wellington during their morning grooming session, the horse's ears pricked forward with unmistakable interest. Robert Clark, the stable manager, was so moved by the letter that he decided to investigate whether it might be possible to arrange a reunion between Sarah and Wellington. After several phone calls and careful coordination, arrangements were made for Sarah and her grandmother to return to London for a very special private visit. This time, instead of viewing Wellington from behind barriers with crowds of tourists, Sarah would have the opportunity to meet him properly in the peaceful environment of the Royal Mews. The day of Sarah's visit dawned bright and clear, with autumn leaves creating a golden carpet around the historic stable buildings. Sarah had barely slept the night before, her excitement mixed with nervous anticipation about whether Wellington would remember her after so many months. Margaret noticed that her granddaughter seemed more confident and settled than she had during their previous visit to London. The riding lessons had given Sarah a new sense of purpose and achievement, and the ongoing adjustments to her parents' separation had become more manageable with time. Still, Wellington remained a powerful symbol of comfort and hope in Sarah's young mind. When they arrived at the Royal Mews, they were greeted by Sergeant Thornton, who had volunteered to facilitate this special reunion. His affection for Wellington had only grown stronger over the months, and he was genuinely curious to see how the horse would respond to seeing Sarah again. "Wellington has been having a remarkable year," Sergeant Thornton explained as he led them through the historic corridors toward Wellington's stable. "Word of his special abilities has spread, and he's been invited to participate in several therapy programs. But, I have to say, your letter was the first time I've seen him show such clear recognition of a name. When I read it to him, his whole demeanor changed." Sarah's heart raced as they approached Wellington's stall. Would he remember her? Had their brief encounter meant as much to him as it had to her? Her questions were answered the moment Wellington saw her face. The magnificent horse immediately moved to the front of his stall, his dark eyes bright with unmistakable recognition. He nickered softly, a sound of welcome that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. It was clear that Wellington not only remembered her but was genuinely pleased to see her again. "Hello, Wellington," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I came back, just like I promised." Wellington reached his head over the stall door, gently nuzzling Sarah's face in greeting. The reunion was everything Sarah had dreamed it would be and more. The horse's warm breath and gentle touch brought back all the comfort she had felt during their first meeting, but now it was enhanced by the growth and healing that had occurred in both their lives. Sergeant Thornton opened the stall door and led Wellington into the stable corridor, where Sarah could interact with him more freely. The horse's behavior was calm but affectionate, clearly demonstrating that this was no ordinary visitor to him. "I've been learning to ride," Sarah announced proudly, stroking Wellington's glossy neck. "My teacher Janet says I have natural ability, and I think it's because you inspired me to understand horses. I can canter now, and I'm learning to jump small fences." Wellington seemed to listen to every word, his ears focused on Sarah's voice. When she finished speaking, he lowered his head and rested his forehead against hers in a gesture of connection that took everyone's breath away. Margaret, watching from a respectful distance, was amazed by the obvious bond between her granddaughter and this extraordinary horse. She had seen Sarah interact with the horses at their local stable, and, while the girl clearly had talent and enthusiasm, there was something different about her connection with Wellington. It was deeper, more spiritual somehow. "I brought you something," Sarah said, reaching into her pocket and pulling out a carefully wrapped sugar cube. Janet said horses like these as treats, but only special ones for very special horses. Wellington accepted the treat with dignified appreciation, crunching it delicately while maintaining eye contact with Sarah. His manners were impeccable, demonstrating the years of training that had made him fit for royal service, but his attention remained focused entirely on his young friend. As they spent time together, Sarah told Wellington about all the changes in her life. She spoke about her riding lessons, her improved relationship with both her parents despite their divorce, and her dreams of someday working with horses professionally. Wellington listened with the patience of a treasured confidant, occasionally making soft sounds of encouragement. "You know what's amazing?" Sarah said thoughtfully. "When I first met you, I was so sad and scared about everything changing. But now I understand that change can sometimes lead to wonderful new things. If my parents hadn't gotten divorced, I probably never would have started riding lessons, and I might never have discovered how much I love horses." The wisdom in Sarah's words was remarkable for someone so young, and Sergeant Thornton found himself moved by the maturity she had developed over the months since their first meeting. Wellington, too, seemed to sense the growth in his young friend, responding to her newfound confidence with obvious approval. During their visit, Sarah was introduced to some of Wellington's stablemates, each magnificent in their own right but none possessing quite the same intuitive understanding that made Wellington so special. However, Sarah's experience with riding had given her confidence around horses in general, and she enjoyed meeting each of them. "Would you like to see Wellington in his ceremonial tack?" Sergeant Thornton asked. "We could dress him up so you can see how he looks when he's performing his official duties." Sarah's eyes lit up with excitement. "Oh yes, please. I've only ever seen him from far away during the ceremony." With careful precision, Sergeant Thornton began the process of putting on Wellington's ceremonial tack. The ornate bridle with its gleaming brass fittings, the perfectly fitted saddle, and all the accompanying equipment transformed Wellington from a gentle stable companion into the magnificent ceremonial horse that represented centuries of British tradition. But, even in his full regalia, Wellington's attention remained focused on Sarah. He stood perfectly still while she admired his appearance, clearly proud to show her this aspect of his identity but more interested in her reaction than in his own impressive appearance. "You look absolutely magnificent," Sarah breathed, walking slowly around Wellington to take in every detail. Like a horse from a fairy tale. But, you're still the same wonderful, kind Wellington underneath all the fancy equipment. Her words seemed to please Wellington enormously. He arched his neck proudly but kept his eyes on Sarah, clearly enjoying her admiration while remaining the gentle, approachable horse she had fallen in love with. As the afternoon progressed, Sarah and Margaret were given a tour of the Royal Mews, learning about the history of the ceremonial horses and the traditions they maintained. But, for Sarah, the highlight remained her time with Wellington, and the confirmation that their bond was as real and meaningful as she had believed it to be. When the time came to say goodbye, both Sarah and Wellington seemed reluctant to part. The horse nuzzled her hand one final time, and Sarah wrapped her arms around his neck in a careful hug. "I'll keep writing to you," she promised. "And I'll keep learning about horses so that maybe someday I can work with horses as wonderful as you. Thank you for being my friend when I needed one most." Wellington's response was a soft nickering sound that seemed to convey his own farewell message. As Sergeant Thornton led him back to his stall, the horse turned back twice to look at Sarah, as though imprinting this moment in his memory. In the months that followed, Sarah's letters became a regular feature of Wellington's life. Sergeant Thornton would read them aloud during grooming sessions, sharing updates about Sarah's riding progress, her school achievements, and her growing confidence. Wellington always listened with obvious interest, and his behavior seemed to brighten on the days when letters arrived. Meanwhile, Wellington's therapeutic work continued to expand. The success of his hospital visit had led to a carefully managed program of visits to various institutions serving children and adults facing challenges. Each visit demonstrated again and again Wellington's remarkable ability to assess what people needed emotionally and respond appropriately. Dr. Foster, who had become something of an expert on Wellington's therapeutic techniques, began collaborating with veterinary and psychology researchers to study the phenomenon he represented. Wellington challenges our understanding of animal cognition and emotional intelligence, she wrote in a research paper that would later be published in several prestigious journals. His ability to read human emotional states and respond with appropriate comfort behavior suggests that the capacity for empathy in animals may be far more sophisticated than we previously understood. Sarah, now 9 years old and an accomplished young rider, had become something of a local celebrity at her riding stable. Her instructor, Janet, often used her as an example when teaching other children, not just because of her technical skills but because of her obvious love for and understanding of horses. "Sarah has something special," Janet explained to a group of parents watching their children take lessons. "She approaches horses with a combination of respect, love, and intuitive understanding that you can't really teach. It's a gift, and I suspect it was awakened by her encounter with that famous horse in London." As Wellington's story spread through various media outlets and social networks, he began to receive visitors from around the world. Horse enthusiasts, animal behaviorists, and people seeking healing all requested opportunities to meet the remarkable horse who had demonstrated such extraordinary empathy. But, perhaps the most meaningful visit came from an unexpected source. Marcus, the boy in the wheelchair whom Wellington had comforted during the documentary filming, had written his own letter requesting to see Wellington again. The encounter had been a turning point in Marcus's life, inspiring him to pursue interests in animal behavior and therapy. When Marcus returned to meet Wellington, he brought with him a detailed drawing he had made of their first encounter. The picture showed Wellington approaching Marcus's wheelchair with the same gentle dignity that had characterized that moment, capturing not just the visual details but somehow conveying the emotional resonance of their connection. Wellington studied the drawing with obvious interest when Marcus showed it to him, and his response was immediate and touching. He gently touched his nose to the paper, as though acknowledging both the accuracy of the image and the sentiment behind it. "You changed my life," Marcus told Wellington during that second visit. "Before I met you, I thought being different meant being less than other people. But, you showed me that being special can actually make you more capable of helping others. I want to work with therapy animals someday, and I want to help other children understand what you taught me." These stories of transformation and healing became the lasting legacy of Wellington's unique gift. He had demonstrated that the bonds between humans and animals could transcend species barriers, offering comfort, hope, and healing in ways that purely human interaction sometimes could not. As the years passed, Wellington continued his dual role as ceremonial horse and informal therapy animal, always maintaining the perfect balance between his official duties and his calling to serve those in emotional need. His story became a reminder that kindness could appear in the most unexpected forms, and that sometimes the most profound healing came not from medical interventions or professional therapy, but from the simple, generous spirit of a horse who understood that love and compassion were the most powerful forces in the world. Sarah, now well into her teens and seriously considering a career working with horses, never forgot the lesson Wellington had taught her during the darkest period of her young life. She had learned that even in times of change and uncertainty, there were always sources of beauty and kindness available to those who remained open to receiving them. And she had learned that sometimes the most important friendships could form in just a few moments of genuine connection, creating bonds that would last a lifetime and inspire countless acts of kindness in return.